At least 70% of the quality of our lives is significantly influenced by one simple element. A simple element that profoundly permeates almost every aspect of our life, but is most times overlooked and taken for granted. The quantity and quality of this simple element in our lives directly affects every aspect of our being, influencing physical and mental health, productivity, and even mortality. In contemporary times, there's much concern about what one should or shouldn't eat. Quality of food no doubt affects and reflects quality of life, but whether vegetarian or carnivore, the one simple element that is absolutely fundamental for all bodily function and well-being is water. Pure water. Think about it. The human fetus is 99% water, and the newborn child is 90%. Before we can even begin to traverse Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there are three things that we absolutely need: air, food, and water. You may make it for more than 3 weeks without food, but you'd be hard-pressed to make it past 3 to 4 days without water. And the relationship between clean water and good health, though obvious, is often completely overlooked. The quality and quantity of water in your life significantly affects every bodily function. All over the world where clean water is abundant, quality of life for all things thrives. Conversely, when there is a lack of clean water, quality of life for all things declines. There is no substitute for water in any of its functions. It has as important a role in the health of the planet as to the human body. No water means no life. In the United States, the general perception of water purity is in need of a serious readjustment. Over the past 5 decades, our environment has drastically changed. The patterns of disease have also profoundly changed. All around the world, diseases in children are substantially increasing, and at the same time, more than 80,000 new chemicals have been developed and released into the global environment. For thousands of years, humans lived in a chemical-free world. Up until about 140 years ago, synthetic chemicals just simply didn't exist. The world was still pristine. Our grandparents drank water that was still untouched by chemicals. Today, there are over 84,000 chemicals in use. Over 5 billion pounds of pesticides are used every year. Pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. Cides is a Latin suffix that translates to kill or to cause death. These chemicals are intentionally designed to kill. A study of over 175 streams showed that every single one of them contained at least one pesticide. 20% of them contained some 10 pesticides. Chemicals are now everywhere in our environment. In the next 25 years, the population will increase by another 2 billion people. And on our current trajectory, world chemical production will increase even faster. Of the 84,000 chemicals known to exist, local water supplies only have to meet the standards on 98 contaminants. What that means is your water can be legally safe, yet at the same time contain very dangerous chemicals. Of the 830 most common contaminants, many are associated with cancer and other diseases. In fact, some of these chemicals are so toxic that extremely small quantities can have very adverse effects on your health. The chemicals amassed in landfills, the rain that falls and collects the air pollution, the billions of pounds of pesticides sprayed on farms, the myriad of pharmaceutical drugs that pass through our wastewater systems, all passes into our lakes, rivers, and streams and seeps into the groundwater. But here's the thing, all the water we consume comes from our lakes, rivers, streams, and groundwater. But our government keeps us safe, right? Right?
I was asked by my supervisor to find out why children who are Hispanic and black have higher levels of lead in their blood than white folks. It turns out that there are alleles that control the amount of material that is absorbed, such as lead, arsenic, heavy metals. Black children have two alleles that increase the absorption rate. Hispanic children have one allele that does and one that doesn't. And Caucasian children have the slowest rate of absorption. I found that extremely disturbing, and I wrote several memoranda suggesting that the levels we were setting that were acceptable of lead were unacceptable for blacks and for Hispanics because they would absorb more given the same exposure.
We are chemical systems. Toxins have such a huge effect on human behavior. And it's really important to understand this because the silicofluorides increase the absorption of the toxins. Lead levels absorbed by blacks in the United States are higher than lead levels absorbed by whites. A survey of children's blood lead, that's called the National Health and Nutrition Evaluation Survey data set, counties over 500,000 population, big cities. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that these are the blacks, these are Hispanics, and these are whites. And this is where there is no silicofluoride in the water, and this is where there's silicofluoride in the water. And you'll notice that there are two things that are going on. First of all, the blacks have higher levels of their lead than the whites. And where there's silicofluoride, there's higher level. But there's a third thing, which is the difference between these two graphs is bigger for blacks than it is for whites. To understand how it is that lead or silicofluoride should affect behavior and change the way we behave or think, you have to understand how the brain works just normally. We know there are some people who have learning disabilities of particular kinds, and that has to do with some part of that system really does not function normally. But let me just talk about the basic pattern of the system. You have these neurons or brain cells, and each one, when a current comes through or an impulse comes through, when something is released across that membrane, at the other end of the receptor cell, it's called the receptor, it's the equivalent of putting a plug in a wall plug, because when a chemical gets into this receptor, it fires the same impulse that was coming down that previous cell. If you have some lead in there, it can block the transmission, like putting chewing gum in a light socket. Lead interferes with dopamine, which interferes with learning, and then you have effects on the brain size, then you have lifelong effects. And if these effects are worse for poor children than for rich children, and I've got statistics that's the case, because poor children have less calcium in their diet. Lead and calcium have both the same electronic charge. They're divalent cations. They have an electric charge of 2 electrons. So that you have a particular place in a protein, and there's supposed to be a calcium there. If there's no calcium, the lead can stick there, change the shape of the protein. Protein doesn't work. So there are a number of different pathways.
A friend of mine named Laura Seidel, who's very much involved with Captain Planet and many of the environmental issues around the country, called me and asked me would I meet with a man named Daniel Stockton and another person from the Lilly Center. So myself and Ambassador Andy Young met with them, and we looked at much of the information. We looked at what fluoride was doing to the teeth. We heard a lot of the information about this particular ingredient in our water and in our toothpaste. So consequently, we began to do a little more research on it, and we wanted to know how did it disproportionately impact on the people that we're called to serve in the African American community.
I became interested in the issue of disproportionate harm to minorities from fluoridation for several reasons. First of all, as a public health professional, I had done some minority health work in my career. I also saw in a publication called Morbidity Mortality Weekly Report from the CDC, in 2005, they had some information that they shared. Buried in the back of this study that they published was a little table, and it showed that Black Americans and Hispanics had disproportionate amounts of dental fluorosis. And I was intrigued by this and disturbed by it, actually. And what a lot of people don't understand, because why would we know about this, is that alloys in brass and bronze and things like this, some of our plumbing fixtures. These plumbing fixtures have lead in them, and sometimes our plumbing lines have lead in them. So the fluoridated water, in some instances where there is the right chemistry in the water, can actually pull lead into the water. The fluorides can help pull lead into the water. So, you know, maybe it's a little bit of lead, but the point is that any lead at all, this is something your body doesn't need.
Cholesterol, cardiovascular diseases, these are diseases which disproportionately impact the African American community. A lot of times it's because of diet. A lot of times it's because we get the information on health later than many other communities. So this is one we want to be the headlight instead of the tail light when it comes to the water that we drink. So this is why, and particularly in the South, because it is so warm, the humidity is so high, we tend to drink a lot of water. And so we need the best level of safety in our drinking water as possible.
As a public health person, I knew that the Black community and Hispanics and other minorities are disproportionately harmed by kidney disease and diabetes. Yet those were two of the populations that the National Research Council said were susceptible subgroups, particularly vulnerable to harm from fluorides. Then on top of it, I found, of course, and we've all known this, and a lot of folks in public health know that minority communities often have a poorer nutritional status. So when you add poor nutrition with added fluoride, the effect gets magnified of the harm from fluorides. Why has the public health community, and why has the medical community and the fluoridation, the supporting community, why have they not actively shared with minority communities the whole story about fluorides? If fluorides are so safe and good in mom's apple pie and all American, then certainly they would stand up to some kind of scrutiny and closer examination. But when I began to address minority health departments in government agencies, for instance, in the state of Tennessee, I was told that the minority health folks would not talk to me anymore. And then we began to approach this issue with the Centers for Disease Control and other places around the country. And over and over and over again, we found out that when we posed the question about how do we reach out to the Black community, how come the Black community hasn't been told, the leaders of the Black community, etc., we got silence, or they changed the subject. Even United States senators and representatives wouldn't pursue this subject. It's one of those things that nobody wants to touch with a 10-foot pole, because the facts are minorities are disproportionately harmed by water fluoridation and other fluorides from other sources.
It's been stated to me that if we come out and speak about these issues in terms of fluoridated water and the impact, that there might be people in higher up positions that might become somewhat angered, disgruntled. People might say that they don't have all of the facts, and I wouldn't argue with that. We don't have all of the facts, but they said that if you begin to speak out against this, it might get a little heat might be put on you. And I said that if you can't stand the heat, you need to get out of the kitchen. And I think that that's quite important, that for those of us who are beginning to try to understand this, that we raise the pertinent issues that can improve the lives of our children and those that we're called to serve.
There is very little information that is made available to members of the minority communities. And let's be honest about it, there's perhaps less access to computers, or maybe less access to the internet. And maybe there's issues with second languages and primary languages. So my concern was, we're all Americans, and it seems to me that all Americans deserve to hear the whole story about fluorides, not just the benefits, but what about how this affects members of the Black community, or Hispanics, or American Indians, or other or Asians. So we began to push this story, and over again we met with resistance. The good news is the thing is cracking open now. Members of the Hispanic community and the Black community have been given this information, and they're waking up to it and saying, this is just not right.
We as a people must be concerned about the welfare and the health of all people. There are certain issues that tend to get swept under the rug. We've got to lift the rug, look at these issues for the good of the people. One of those is fluoridated water and what's in water. And we've got to, in some way, get all of the research necessary and remove it if it is detrimental. I tend to believe that it is harmful. So if we're to make a difference, we've all got to come together. We've got to come together as parents. We've got to come together as clergy. We've got to come together as science. We've got to come together as legislators and medical profession. We've all got to come together. And if we all can come together around this issue, we can find out where the truth is. And if we can find out the truth, then we can make a difference. And I think that that's what we're all called to do. I think everybody in this, whether they're on one side or the other on the issue, we're all concerned about how do we become a healthier people who can really have a beautiful smile like this.
Unlike filters and other membrane technologies, nature's hydrologic cycle, evaporation, condensation, and precipitation, is a huge, non-barrier solar thermal cycle that consistently produces pure water. Steam distillation systems mimic nature's hydrologic cycle. It is the only treatment process that first boils the raw water, then condenses the pure steam to form very high purity drinking water, the absolute best protection from contaminants. It is the single most effective broad-spectrum core method of water purification, consistently producing high-purity drinking water year after year, saving both money and the environment.
We live by necessity in a contaminated world. We face disgust and contamination all the time. We just get through life, like with a lot of things, by basically not thinking about it. All water comes from sewage, but the point is you don't think about it when you turn your tap.
The plant itself is an amazing process where you can actually take dirty, filthy, disgusting water and make it clean so it's fishable and swimmable in the area around New York.
The debris that comes in is the debris that comes from our toilets, our sinks, our bathrooms, and also from the street. As emerging things change, they wind up in the waste stream, and we see it here. Up until maybe 8 years ago or so, we very rarely saw bottled water. It's very prevalent now. The spirit of the times. If 100 pounds of waste product comes in with all that water, I have to remove 85 pounds of it, and the 15 pounds remaining is legally allowed to go into the receiving waters.
The treatment of sewage, it's a very simple biological process in which we're just speeding up nature. There's a lot of talk nowadays about chemicals coming into the systems and antibiotics that are coming into the systems, and those things were never meant to be treated in a domestic wastewater treatment plant. Right now, they cannot possibly deal with the myriad of chemicals that are out there.
We are becoming experiments for these synthetic chemicals. And when the liver takes these chemicals out of our bodies, what happens? They get flushed down the toilet, and then they go into the aquifer. And then they go into our rivers and streams. We take the water from the rivers and streams, and we put it into our public water supply systems, and we're drinking it again.
All those pharmaceuticals, all those cosmetics, all the stuff that's in there, you know what? It's changing the chemistry in our bodies, and it's hurting us.
The traditional pollution scenario was a large industrial pipe sticking out of the side of a factory, spewing brown gunk into the pristine waters, and seeing the fish and the ducks die. Then there were a few astonishing examples of water pollution. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio burst into flames in 1969.
It was just so bizarre. How can water catch fire?
This case made national headlines and galvanized the environmental movement.
People start pollution. People can stop it.
The net result of that was the foundation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the signing of the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act in the early 70s. It was originally a very strong law, but times have changed. Pollution in America is increasing rather than decreasing. In the 5 years between 2004 and 2009, the Clean Water Act was violated 500,000 times. The old pollution was a river on fire. The new pollution is something you can't even see.
Whether it's birth control pills, erectile dysfunction medicines, hormone supplements, our bodies absorb some of them, we excrete the rest of the chemicals, we flush them away, they go to the treatment plant, and they are not removed.
Consider Vast Lake Mead. Tests have found trace levels of birth control, steroids, narcotics, and more.
The U.S. is the leading producer of these new contaminants. We don't know how harmful these chemicals are, and there are more added all the time. The EPA approves 1,000 to 2,000 chemicals a year. The more difficult and dangerous ones are industrial contaminants.
We mustn't forget that these chemicals were designed for warfare. They are the ultimate weapons of mass destruction. Every one of them came out of the war system. Now they are in our drinking water.
People assume that there's somebody in the government protecting their water supply, and that's often not the case. One of the most extraordinary examples of that is the most common pesticide sprayed in the United States, atrazine.
Atrazine itself is an herbicide or a weed killer, and it's used on products such as corn. It is the #1 contaminant found in drinking water and groundwater and surface water. Initially, we were contracted by Syngenta, the makers of atrazine, and their interest was in trying to understand whether or not, so they said, whether or not atrazine could function as an endocrine disruptor, meaning could it interfere with hormones such as thyroid hormone, testosterone, estrogen. We found that atrazine had a number of effects, but most significantly, atrazine demasculized the exposed male frogs. I would even say chemically castrated. We went on to show that in addition to being demasculized, they were also feminized. So in other words, male amphibians would grow ovaries and even produce eggs. Fish show similar effects. Their sperm counts drop and they start to make egg yolk protein. Does that mean that atrazine is causing a global decline in sperm counts in men? Again, the experimental and the epidemiological data suggest that atrazine may play a very significant role. It's also associated with prostate cancer and some of the factories that produce atrazine, as well as with breast cancer and some studies that look at women whose water is contaminated with atrazine. One big concern might be fetuses that, in effect, are living in water. So if that fetus gets exposed to a chemical, it's constantly drinking its amniotic fluid. In the entire European Union, atrazine has been banned. And in effect, that is the only way you can limit atrazine levels because it can travel up to 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers in the rainwater. In fact, of the 80 million pounds of atrazine we use in the United States, about 500,000 pounds of that atrazine comes back in the rainwater.
Starting at 0.1 parts per billion, we started getting these hermaphrodites. And that's an incredible number, 0.1 parts per billion. The drinking water standard for atrazine is 3 parts per billion. That's 30 times higher than we know is biologically harmful in amphibians and in fish. That's an average over the year So in the season when it's applied, it's going to be much higher than that. And those data are now coming to light, especially in the Midwest, where most of the atrazine is used.
Several Southern Illinois water districts have joined a lawsuit against an herbicide maker. They claim the chemical atrazine is contaminating their water supply.
Water utilities in Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa are suing Syngenta to recover the cost of filtering out atrazine.
The company that makes atrazine, they're based out of Switzerland. That's a funny thing because atrazine is effectively banned in Europe. In Europe, they utilize something called the precautionary principle, which says that if there's any data to suggest that something's harmful, the manufacturer has to prove that it's safe or it's off the market. So you're guilty until proven innocent. In the US, it's the opposite. You're innocent until proven guilty. So the company's charged with proving that their compound's bad, otherwise it stays on the market.
You can't find out what any of the chemicals are that are being deployed out into the environment under something referred to as the Halliburton loophole. The Halliburton loophole was pushed through by then Vice President Cheney. Cheney exempted all of the oil and gas fracking companies from the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's insanity.
Based on the Toxic Substances Control Act. Since 1976, EPA has issued regulations to control only 5 existing chemicals determined to present an unreasonable risk. That is 5 out of almost 80,000 existing chemicals. A 2005 study found 287 different chemicals in the cord blood of 10 newborn babies. Our kids are getting steady infusions of industrial chemicals before we even give them solid food.